as was mentioned in the morning, that the All India Conference is meant to showcase new research, new directions of research, meant to bring the kind of themes and avenues that are being looked at by the body of scholars and researchers and, of course, independent intellectuals. And by bringing it to this conference, to this platform, we are also therefore bringing what is happening in the field of China studies in very specific areas to this body, which is obviously looking also for newer ideas for research. And what we hope is that as these different panelists cover their respective areas and give you a sense of scholarship, discourse, new groundbreaking studies, new people who are starting to look at various kinds of different aspects about China's developments. As we bring this to this gathering, we hope to ignite interest in some of the ideas that will come up here in the survey, and therefore open up newer pathways. The second thing is that these are all scholars who have put in more than a decade of study and research in their respective fields, and therefore the way in which they survey their field comes from the vantage point of somebody who is immersed in a particular field. And therefore when they bring up these current discourses, it comes from, again, a scholarly base. And what we are above all trying to do is emphasize as much as we can the importance of in-depth studies. You know, when our students start on their PhD researches, the first thing we tell them is that make your research a mile deep and an inch proper. Don't make it the other way around. A mile in length and 1 inch in depth. So these current discourses will help you also look at what are the kind of areas that are emerging, which are of concern to the China watching community. Okay, with those few kind of introductory remarks, let me start this particular panel. I have done a little bit of jiggling with the order, and Anushka, you will go first. Now, you all have got access to the abstracts, and frankly, a cumulative 5 to 7 minutes will be spent if I try to give you background of everybody. So I'm just going to mention that she's a staff research analyst in the Indo-Pacific Studies program at the Takshashila Institute, Bengaluru, and that she is one of the rising, prolific writers on the themes that she sort of talk about. So focus on the themes she's saying, and you can then follow her writings, which are immensely meticulous. I love the way in which she brings together a lot of empirical data, but manages to give me an argument at the end of it. And that's really Anushka for you.
Thank
So
you.
you each have 10 minutes, and depending on
This is the second time I'm presenting for the state of the field, but I think in the past 1 year so much has happened that this is altogether a new dynamic that I hope to bring to what I've analyzed and examined from the studies that I'm going to be talking about today. And of course, in terms of experience, I'm just a smidge short of a decade, Professor Acharya. Of course, the dais is much more esteemed and prolific. But again, like I said, I do my best. So today, as the panel suggests, I hope to share with you some of the things that I've examined from assessing, as they say, discourses in Chinese studies with a specific focus on China's technological and innovation ecosystem. And just to quickly signpost, there are 3 broad domains, subdomains as it were, within this broad domain that I'd like to focus on. One is the economy driving innovation. The second is the strategy behind innovation, and the third are the implications that come out of this persistent focus on technological breakthroughs or technological obsession, as Ambassador Kant so prolifically put it this morning, that we see in China. Now, let's begin with the economy of innovation, right? And it helps to look at this from a political economy perspective. So essentially addressing the question, how does geopolitics and geoeconomics shape the system and the kind of behavior that China exhibits in that system? And before I come to what we see contemporarily and in the latest writings, let me take you back just a minute, right? In the 60s and the 70s, we saw that a beach ball sized satellite led to a technological arms race between two great powers of the time, right? USSR and the United States. And eventually what was competition in domains of outer space eventually turned into competition in missile technology, computing, even semiconductors. They're not a recent affair, or competition therein is not a recent affair. It goes back to the Cold War. And there's a compelling explanation of this that is presented in Mark Zachary Taylor's book, The Politics of Innovation. And the idea that he articulates is creative insecurity. So what creative insecurity, and it's a very compelling theory, right? The first time I heard it and read about it, I was like, bang on, this is what explains how the US and China are acting right now, right? What it offers is an idea that it's not necessarily domestic drivers or domestic perceptions of threat, but a hostile external environment, and not just in the military domain, but in terms of geoeconomics or geopolitics in general, that actually drives the quest for innovation. And it's not just that it affects China alone, it affects both parties. So, on the one hand, you have a revisionist power that has the drive to innovate and wants to match up to that quote-unquote status quoist power. And seeing that rise and that quest, you have the status quoist power trying to actually invest in technological breakthroughs, and eventually that turns into what we colloquially refer to as an arms race or a technological race or a trade war, so on and so forth, right? So this is very akin, or this is an apt description, so to say, of what we're seeing vis-a-vis the US and China today. And in some ways, it's a debatable idea, but in some ways it does take us back to what we saw between the US and USSR during Cold War years. So, Mark Zachary Taylor, Politics of Innovation. Right now, I'm sure many of you, and we talked about this morning, Ambassador Kant talked about it in his remarks, we've heard of the ASPE tracker, right? They came up with some rankings on who's doing the best in the technological domain in the world today. They measured parameters on pertaining to biotechnology, semiconductors, AI, quantum, so on and so forth, right? The big keywords of the 21st century, if you will. And they found that China was leading in 37 out of 44 of those sectors. Now, you can debate the merits of their methodology, or you can say they're spot on with this assessment, right? But the big problem is the perception that it creates in the minds of those sitting in the US. And we saw something similar happen when, you'll do well to remember this, the Huawei SMIC breakthrough, right, with the Mate 60 Pro, that was 2 years ago. And the idea was that, look, China's access to DUV and UV lithography tools coming from the Netherlands was restricted, and yet they were able to put cutting-edge chips in the Mate 60 Pro. Huawei was able to do that in collaboration with SMIC, which is a Chinese semiconductor manufacturing company. Then DeepSeek rolled around last year, and again the concerns in the West largely, but also in other parts of the world, were that we've been doing something or the other incessantly to restrict China's access to AI GPUs, and yet they've been able to come up with R1 of DeepSeek, which is revolutionary because it creates experts for the topics that you want to talk about. So it's different from ChatGPT or Perplexity or whatever else he used, right? So the psychological implications of this, more than anything else, also create a pillar for better understanding creative insecurity, and then eventually drive the implementation and the practice that you see in the US, right? And it, again, like I said, it goes both ways. So just the threat of 100% tariff means that China is going to re-up its willingness to weaponize geoeconomics, and as a result of that, we see today that in its hazy attempt to gain leverage or find leverage, as it were, we see the wide sweeping and the incremental and marginal restrictions on rare earth elements and magnets that we've seen on the 9th of October, right? So in many ways, I would argue that this is China trying to make China plus one a reality. and yet it thinks there is merit in doing so precisely because of psychological perception and eventually what that follows in practice, right? And in the broader context of this hostile environment, then comes in a text that is again seminal, written by David Edelstein, called Over the Horizon. And we adapted a framework on this at Takshashila, where we talked about the horizons on which great powers operate. There are short horizons and there are long-term horizons of risk, innovation, seeking breakthroughs, so on and so forth. So if you put it on a 2x2 matrix, if there are two great powers, the US and China, if they're both operating on a short-term horizon, let's say the US is operating on a long-term horizon and China is operating on a short-term horizon. So China wants its incessant breakthroughs fast, and the US is not really concerned with its position in the world or its dominance in the world. Then you were likely to see more cooperation between those two countries. But today, because both of them are operating on a short horizon, you see the kind of competition that exists. Now you can call it a state of cooperativeness, that's different, but essentially competition in trade and technology has been widely accepted as a feature of geopolitics and geoeconomics today. Now, what are the implications of this? This brings me to my second bit, right? There's a 2025 text called Breakneck by Thanwar, and what he basically, and he offers a very interesting characterization. He says China is an engineering state and the US is a loyalty state. So as an engineering state, China, Dr. Rama talked about, builds massively at hyperscale, invests rapidly, and then you sleep in the morning without hearing any construction sounds, and in the morning there's a building standing upright there, right? But the US is more concerned with contracts and loopholes and legalities and so on and so forth. So we don't see the kind of hyperscale investment we see there. But again, and this is for anyone who really appreciates irony. The engineering state that's building the hyperscale infrastructure and achieving all of these massive feats of innovation is actually plagued by something that we can understand as control neurosis. And Angela Zhang, in her 2024 text, talks about high wire. She agrees, and she says that look, 2 years ago when we saw the Chinese state cracking down on online tutoring firms or gambling platforms or those who invest money in online gaming or other platforms, when that crackdown happened, the goal of the CCP was to be able to solve income inequality and make sure no one's being exploited online and build an innovative ecosystem where people earn money through merit. And yet what that ended up doing, even as it did push high tech, was create a much stronger administrative state. And so this dilemma where there is creative insecurity driving innovation, but in a not so creative control, restricting freedom of innovation, is something that is very unique to China. And so what I offer you today based on this assessment is that as interesting as it is to study China's case as a market failure or a distorter of global markets, it's as interesting to see how, just like in the uniqueness of its political economy, right? Just like we say that in India, two dichotomies exist, and yet this is its political economy. Jugaad is India's political economy. The same way, this persistent ebb and flow of creative insecurity driving innovation and administrative control, cracking down on what they would perceive as excessive innovation, is unique to the Chinese economy. And in the military domain, which is sort of my comfort food, this tension again shows up dramatically. And we talked about the fourth plenum this morning, yesterday, and in the preceding few days, we saw that if a missile didn't function, half the PLA rocket force leadership disappeared, right? And then if the PLA was unable to integrate network centricity in its combat preparedness endeavors, the strategic support force disappeared, right? Or was rebranded, as it were. And genuinely, I do believe that the CMC, the Central Military Commission, and the PLA believe that these organizational changes create efficiency, but they also create a lack of trust in the grassroots. They also create dilemmas in the mind of soldiers as to, is our job safe? Is our leadership trustworthy? Is what we are doing enough? So this dichotomy, again, very, very interesting to follow, especially in the PLA. And this finally brings me to my few takeaways on the strategy behind innovation. So we talked about the driving political economy. We talked about the implications a little bit for the strategy itself. But I think now is the time when you should take away a bit about strategy as well, because we've talked again about what India can learn from China, what the playbook is like, and after I'm done with this, you can make your decisions on that. So there's a 2023 text by Lee, China's drive for the technological frontier, and he uses a interesting framework called social conditions of innovative enterprise. And that framework brings up an important question. Under what social or organizational conditions will an enterprise thrive even in the existence of strategic control? And thrive cumulatively, empowering others, not in the situation of involution, right, where you're selling an EV well below the price level at which you manufactured it. So in China's case, indigenous innovation, and this is just to attempt to answer this question, right? In China's case, indigenous innovation happens by absorbing global knowledge, mobilizing domestic resources, and it's nationwide mobilization, by the way, and then climbing the technological ladder with the goal that you will reach the frontier. The frontier would be the advanced of any domain, right? Many industrial economies have deployed this. The only difference is that there is a relatively free market hand when these processes or this flowchart works out. And in China, there's a heavy hand of the state. And but again, that said, there are non-state firms like Huawei, like Tencent, that deploy different strategies for becoming internationally competitive. Huawei takes domestic user feedback, Tencent uses domestic market experience, and both of them have eventually internationalized using that. Now, if one defines innovation as a number of patents filed, obviously you will see that there are local governments in China that provide massive subsidies for filing patents, right? Then similarly, if we talk about automakers, right? Of course, we've talked about Xiaomi this morning, but then what is the one automaker that comes to mind when we think about China and automaking, right? The biggest EV sales entity in the world, it's BYD, right? And yet, despite these massive feats, there are only a handful of Chinese global firms that are dominant in the market as a whole. So again, as interesting as its quest for innovation is, the question remains: can it sustain it with the continued existence of a hand of the state, a restriction on democratic freedom in thinking, and military-civil fusion again is a big pillar of how the PLA innovates, and yet it creates obvious fallacies when China thinks of export, right? And India would certainly want something that was that could both be used in the military domain and the civilian domain. And this is a question not just India, but other countries in the world are struggling with as well. So again, the question that I'm going to leave you with in all of this assessment is this. We must not ask whether China can innovate or not, because we know it can. But the question to ask is whether it can build an environment that sustains innovation organically and not administratively. Thank you so much.
Thanks. So we have here two keywords coming out of our presentation: creative security, control neurosis. Now the question really which came out of Ashok's talk this morning, how does homegrown frameworks understand this? If creative insecurity is leading to these fantastic achievements, can India have some? We are pretty insecure as far as China is concerned. Why don't we transfer some of our creativity into matching that? But yes, interesting question that you have left us with. The only one thing that occurs to me that, this regular kind of refrain about China as the great disruptor. Ashok again referred to this wrecking ball that Trump has taken. Why isn't the US being called the great disruptor of the 21st century. Just a question, but yeah. So why is it only this label becomes China? In my view, is hugely status quoist. But anyway, more on that, as I said. Yes, I go back at the of daily. You will, you will. All right, Atul, be our next speaker. He is a fellow in the Strategic Studies program at the Observer Research Foundation in Delhi. He had a longish stint in Australia where he cut his teeth on a lot of Western scholarship, which, again, Ashok referred to. But let's see what he is going to tell us about assertive and adaptive surveying recent scholarship on Chinese fund.
Yes. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you. I am Indore and ICCS for inviting me today. This is my first time I'm presenting this state of the field, and so bear with me. The defining question which I started with was, how do I see Chinese foreign policy? Is it assertive? Is it adaptive? Is it wolf warrior type? Or is it something else? And now if you look at the Chinese foreign policy, when we were studying China in the first decade of the millennium, you would meet Chinese diplomats and they would be cautious, ambiguous. It's like, I know you, that you know that I know, that sort of people. And they will always refrain from directly attacking anybody, especially when it comes to US or the EU. There'll be calls for peace, negotiation, and all sort of stuff. Then we saw this era coming up around 2008, 2009, when everybody started talking about Chinese assertive diplomacy, which is like this entire philosophy of wolf warrior diplomats, especially with 𝐂𝐲 and his cohorts, Wang Wenping, and everyone started. But even that, I think, started getting into that reducing return. So by 2022, there is some sort of recalibration happening in the Chinese foreign ministry. And now we see some sort of, a balance coming up, which is basically assertive yet adaptive. And this is the theme of presentation today. And here there is one book which is, I believe it brilliantly covers this thing. How do you see the assertiveness of Chinese foreign policy? This is through its diplomats, how they behave these days. And on this, there is a book by Dylan M.H. Low. He's the associate professor at NTU Singapore. And this book is called China's Rising Foreign Ministry. And he explains how, over the years, the MOFA has gained much more importance in foreign policy making. Not only the implementation, but at least guiding and advising the foreign policy nuances. And here, the focus is on 4 key issues. One is basically on the controlling social media, Twitter, spokesperson briefings, through the visual explanation of all the Chinese foreign policy debate. And there the focus is on countering narratives. So China believes that if it controls the narrative, it is able to explain its stance on foreign policy in that way. Second is, if you look at the MOFA's internal promotional structure, all the diplomats who are aggressive, who are vocal, who are far more, countering narratives and not restraining on these issues, they are being promoted. There is internal training, there is internal promotional levels, and somehow there is a very tight correlation between Central Foreign Affairs Commission, the Propaganda Department, and the MOFA, which was not happening earlier, because earlier there used to be some sort of balance between what was the domestic messaging, what was the external messaging. And even here, there are variations. Like when it comes to core issues, the Chinese foreign policy is quite assertive. Core issues means, Taiwan or South China Sea, or it is on diaspora issues, on human rights. They are far more assertive. But when it comes to issues which are a little bit on the sidelines, say peripheral issues, for example, in the Middle East, the conflicts happening all over the world, they are still very cautious. They still take a very kind of ambiguous line, do not play the full hand. And the variations and all this performance, it happens that half of this assertiveness is basically theatrical. You see all this finger wagging, you see spokespersons or briefings, they are pretty direct. But at the end of the day, you see the policy being followed, which is basically a pretty balanced one. Now, if I'll give you an example, for the last 2-3 months, there has been so much going on between US and China. But even on that, even though Xi Jinping showed such friendship with Putin, day before yesterday, all the Chinese companies have stopped buying oil from Russian oil producing fields. So even though the theater is there that we are assertive, we are going to follow up on our core interests, but when it comes to policy issues, when it comes to the critical red lines, Chinese are still cautious. So they are assertive, but still adapting to the circumstances. Now, here what happens is, I'm looking at another 4 books which are dealing with this dominant theme. The 2 books are on the hardline side, the 2 books are on the nuance side. The first book, which deals, and apologies because most of these books are written in the West, so they do have perspective bias. But the problem is, if I use a lot of Chinese material, there is also a perspective bias. There is also a little bit of credibility bias. So I have to be a little bit judicious on this. So here the first book is by Elizabeth C. Economy. She is a long-time China hand. She is a senior fellow at Hoover Institution, and she was senior fellow at CFR for a long time. Her core argument, her book is called The World According to China. The core argument which she proposes is, China is no longer satisfied merely to integrate in existing international order. Basically, it seeks to actively reshape the world order in accordance with its interests, values, and governance models. And this is where she mentions, and it has been quoted quite a bit, that she is neither a reactionary revolutionary and nor a passive reformer. She, as Ambassador Kanta said in the morning, is very technologically oriented, and he believes that even though the real drivers of economy will be proliferating in the long run, but it's the technology which is going to drive the whole Chinese economy in the future era. Even though there are a lot of debates, and in this plenum also there were a lot of debates of what kind of stream of technology which China is going to follow for a new model for future growth. But in terms of the high-tech growth, in terms of the China's focus on EV, China's focus on clean energy, China's focus on green energy, there is no doubt that Xi Jinping is pushing it as much as possible to make it the next growth driver for China. Now, Elizabeth also says that there is another factor which drives the Chinese foreign policy to a large extent, which is this idea that China is central, China needs to be central in 3 domains: geographically, economically, and political ideologically. And there she says that if you look at Made in China 2025 or the dual circulations or the BRI, they are basically all the drivers which is pushing the Chinese economy to get to the center stage. And even though she is confident, but the factor is that she believes that she is very confident when it comes to domestic politics. I do agree a little bit with her because if I remember a few years ago, I mean a decade ago, Indian government dismissed one of our admirals, Vishnu Bhagwat, and that became a huge issue in India, Indian politics. Now, if you look at China, in the last 2 years, he has dismissed more than 25 generals and admirals and senior officials. And I don't think she is in any trouble. So she is confident. He is far more confident than what we think. And all these rumors about him being in trouble and things, politics being in trouble is basically not correct. Okay. Now, the similar kind of another book there is by Bethany Ellen Brahimia. She wrote a book called Breaking Rules: How China Weaponized Its Economy to Confront the World. And this book is also basically it is taking economy as a factor and reflecting that by controlling access, by controlling investments, by controlling access to Chinese market, Xi Jinping has been able to push his assertiveness to a large level on the international political level. This is one dominant thing. The second dominant thing is by 2 other books. One is by Bates Gill called Daring to Struggle: China's Global Ambitions Under Xi Jinping. And the other one is by a senior China person, Oriana Schuyler Mastro. The book is called Upstart: How China Became a Great Power. And the central theme which they are saying is that China has followed basically 3 ideas: imitation, exploitation, and innovation. China has imitated wherever the best practices it has seen is happening in the West. So, for example, China believes that it should expand in UN, it should expand in international economic institutions. So, China has done that. It has also exploited wherever there is a gap. For example, there is a gap in investing in Africa, Latin America. So, it has come up with BRI, it has come up with banks, it has come up with all those sorts, where it can exploit the gaps where West is absent. But third and final argument is that China has also innovated a lot when it comes to policy prescriptions, when it comes to international engagement, when it comes to military developments. And these three focus, which Oriana calls upstart strategy, has been able to push China to the main front, to the, as a serious power in the world without provoking the American or the Western organized competition or organized containment. And here, what strikes me is Oriana is basically suggesting the US government and the Western governments to actually copy their own upstart strategy and come up to kind of counter China. This leaves me with final question. What should we do? Do we also need an upstart strategy? That's it.
Okay, thank you. That was a very quick wrap up, and I think it's a very interesting point that in one sense, both Anushka and Akhil's presentations have brought out the fact that recent publications are really all trying to get a key to this great China story, and most of it is giving the state perspective as to how the state and the leader is playing a role. So Anushka, of course, raised the question whether this is sustainable. And to my mind, that would be chasing the wrong end. The fact is that this state-led kind of an approach, which again, Ashoka referred to Cruz's podcast. I would recommend all of you to listen to that. A fascinating argumentation that is done, has sustained it over the last 3 decades. So to study the way in which the Chinese state has controlled, maybe be it flexible or thing about created insecurity. I mean, I think the need of the hour is to study the way in which the Chinese state has operated. Going into speculation about whether it is sustainable or not is another part of the story. But this, as to how it has managed to both control and be flexible, is something that is, I think, model needs to be studied carefully. Okay, we now move on to Anand. So Anand is a fellow at the Center of Excellence for Himalayan Studies, School of Humanities, Social Sciences, Shiv, Nadar, Institution of Eminence. I was told to specifically refer to Institution of Eminence. He's an adjunct fellow at the Institute of Chinese Studies, assistant editor of journal China Importantly. So Anand has had an interesting journey in terms of studying what is obviously something that comes out of a very ideologically engaged subject. He has looked at labor issues very carefully, and he's going to tell us is about the Chinese political economy the last 5 years. I hope he will bring his special focus into this. But over to you.
Thank you, Professor Acharya, and thanks to both the Indian Institute of Management Indore and the Institute of Chinese Studies for having me at this edition of the conference. So when Venkat gave me this enormous challenge of in the state of the field, which I don't seem to have done at all. So I went through the last few conferences where state of the field was discussed and where this huge ocean-like aspect of political economy, I didn't find much. So I decided that instead of trying to swim through the whole water body, rather choose 2 specific points, which are largely on industrialization and labor, which is what is my research area primarily been at. And so largely talk about these 2 components with in this particular session or in my take. So to begin with, we have something really fresh from yesterday, which has already been alluded to. The fourth plenum of the Communist Party of China has adopted what will be the 15th five-year plan. Of course, further details are awaited, what exactly the plan is, what it needs to be looked at, and which is also important from a research perspective, because at least we have been encouraged to look at primary documents. And even so, now that you have AI and now you have new handles, new networks, so on and so forth, but still some of these documents are extremely essential to go through to look at what the Chinese party state led by the Communist Party thinks. So researching using primary documents is of extreme importance. So the 15th five-year plan, at least as far as the communique by the party says, it's to maintain a reasonable proportion of the manufacturing sector and establish a modern industrialized system which advanced manufacturing as its backbone. So this is essentially doubling down, as Ambassador Kanta pointed out in his keynote, as the high quality development as the theme will continue, and which Xi Jinping has been talking about so strongly about Chinese style modernization. So high quality development and Chinese style modernization are inextricably linked. So what the communique talks about is having a development environment during this period, because what the context is about the world in terms of global challenges, trade wars, tariff wars, so increasing uncertainties and risks which come with it. So the need is to ensure that development, reform and innovation are undertaken to meet people's growing needs for a better life. If you remember, this is the principal contradiction which was identified by Xi Jinping in the 19th Party Congress of unequal or imbalanced development, and on the one hand that people's ever-growing needs on the other. So basically, this is what the three things of development, reform and innovation is what the party will be driving at, and it will be under the strict governance of the party. So essentially, this is the new development philosophy which she and the leadership is talking about. So it is the five components within it are innovative, driven, coordinated, green, open, and shared. So in alignment to this new development philosophy, you also have what is increasingly being talked about as new quality productive forces. So basically, industrial upgrading, putting emphasis on quality over quantity and also over speed. So somehow also the fact that China has achieved so much with higher scale and higher speed of development seems to have contributed to this overcapacity problem. So to move from low intensive, labor intensive manufacturing to high end technology intensive industries which are essentially Chinese, or which have classically have the Chinese flavor. So whether it is robotics, aerospace, semiconductors, EVs, AI, all that will have essentially be Chinese in its nature. Essentially, this builds on the Made in China 2025, which was launched in 2015, which had targeted 10 critical areas, and this thus moves on. And again, some of the other concepts which have come in this duration is also dual circulation, because China understands the fact that global risk and this export-driven model can face the headwinds of global risk and uncertainties as it is now. So the emphasis has been to boost domestic consumption, because China also has a huge market, the scale and size, I think, which is also one of the reasons why Chinese companies also want to look at a market like India, because it also has the same level of scale and an increasingly middle class base who are driven by consumption. So that is something which is a challenge, but that challenge constantly remains as far as China is concerned, because there are structural issues in this entire nature of development. So what this drives at is the fact that industrialization, which is the core of Chinese modernization, but that industrialization will be under the supervision and the oversight of the Chinese Communist Party. And so what that makes the industrialization is not just economic, but it is also ideological. And what also that means, the supervision of the party has also meant that there is going to be centralization. So you have a stronger CPC oversight and you have new bodies being created, such as Central Science and Technology Commission, Central Finance and Economic Affairs Commission. So earlier times when there was a differentiation between the state and the party, and it was the premier who was largely involved in such governance issues. And now we have seen over the last term of Xi Jinping, there is more authority and management which are centralized and unified by the Communist Party. So there is more direct coordination, for instance, between the NDRC or the planning body and CPC's own top decision-making body. And there's also emphasis on directions and coordination. So, for instance, certain areas and strategic sectors have been identified by the party where it would require central approval. So, for instance, if you are looking for semiconductor projects in China today, that would require only approval from the central state or central party state, rather than any at the local or at the provincial level. So there is integration of party committees into companies. So there is strong ideological guidance of science and industry, and so what that makes is industrial policy is now both developmental and also disciplinary. In fact, the recent issue of the 𝐂𝐮 magazine also has an interesting article which talks about the fact that now, from crossing the river by feeling the stones, as Tanshaping called, it is now moving to accurately feeling the stones while crossing the river. So this essentially means that innovation, or the local innovation, which was mostly, there was a lot of flexibility for actors down in the hierarchy to do that. Now that seems to be more curated under top-end guidance by the party. So basically, all your pilots, which was something very key in China's developmental experience, that seems to be now getting reconditioned. But even within this, there is also the strong role of the private sector, but again, the role of the private sector. If you want to also look at what exactly is private in China, that remains a question which is extremely blurred. So what the party the talks about is from antagonism to harmonious coexistence of different economic models, and that means complementary relationship between public and private. What the state is essentially trying to do is to corral the private sector to align themselves with the national objectives of increasing consumption and indigenous innovation. Also, private companies are also very key pillar in actualizing what is now increasingly a phenomenon of global China. So, global China is very integral to the global capitalist system, and so this development is also going to be guided by the party. So, increasingly, what you have seen over the last 5 to 10 years is also the fact that Chinese companies, which were hitherto not as much under the scanner, or you did not necessarily link the state with these companies have seemed to have a very exalted and elevated amount of roles. So companies like Huawei, companies like CATL, or companies like BYD, they are now becoming their own. They're getting reshaped. They are getting their own elevated status, and also their operations in different geographies are also attracting or binding them to the larger objective of the Chinese industrial policies and Chinese industrial vision. So that's as far as the industrial thing is concerned. And quickly to look at the other aspect of industrial policy is also something which moves, which Chan talks about, the fact of industrial diplomacy, which is Chinese manufacturers centered around investment and how their upward experience moves. So one of the important books for this to look at is, of course, the popular book of House of Huawei by Qiwa, which is very deeply researched, chronicling the rise of Chinese tech entity. Quickly now moving on to labor is the fact that with digital technologies over the last 2 to 3 years, new flexible forms of employment have been receiving center of attention from the Chinese party state. One of the books to go about on this is From Click to Boom by Liu, the political economy of e-commerce in China. And in fact, she talks about this concept of institutional outsourcing, where e-commerce platforms have taken over roles traditionally held by the state as contract enforcement, fraud detection, and labor dispute mechanism. So the party side itself has given these priorities. So for instance, it identified during the pandemic that the role of new forms of employment or the gig workers or the platform workers is extremely critical. So there was amendment to the trade union law to recognize and include workers as new forms of employment, signing their contracts. And Xi Jinping is now talking about something called the service-oriented model, where for workers, trade unions are their homes and trade unions officials are so close to them as if they are their family members. So it's a top-down service-oriented model where the trade union officials' interactions or engagement with workers is outside your workplaces, and it's more in terms of providing or provisioning of services. So this is a reimagination of your traditional labor work unit networks. And even within this, there is innovation being asked and encouraged. So trade union staff and financial resources from higher level are moved to lower local levels within the districts and cities, though without additional staff and resources allocated to enterprise units. So I mean, and my final point is also to look at how these gig workers or the new forms of employment, the party is also looking to expand its outreach to them, to get them involved in party building efforts, and so that even though this entire space is more fragmentary, mobile in nature, but the party is also trying to be adept in terms of offering them symbolic incentives and also selective mobilization. So there is, of course, the final point of how much of the gig workers are represented by or feel invested in the party, that's altogether an important question that still needs a lot of reflection. But definitely there has been identification of the fact that this is a sector in which the party's reach needs to be extended. So those are the few things I wanted to share, and I hope I'm happy to receive questions on.
Thanks, Anand. I think he brought in a very, very important and the significant, often overlooked dimension of the importance of looking at the primary sources, looking at the documents, speeches, the papers that are produced, policy papers and so on, which require a lot of effort. I gave my students a lot of grief during my political economy classes by making them write commentaries on various documents, notable documents over the years. Read the fine print, read between the lines, because a lot of this granular understanding we keep talking about can only come out of textual reading, and we need to see the significance and the importance of taking these documents seriously and not just dismissing it as propaganda. Because what came out of Anand's reading of these primary sources was a very different way in which the party is trying to move into now areas to again expand their control, their domination, ways in which you try to expand party's reach. And this is not something that can come out of a simple, reading of analysis. So this comes out of primary source, crawling through the primary sources. Thanks for that. But again, he also has brought in how innovation is really taking hold of the national imagination. Usha is the next speaker. She teaches at the JNU, and she will be bringing in the culture and literature aspect. So obviously, the social dimension. We are talking about how innovation is becoming the national obsession. But how is it being filtered through the cultural consciousness? What are the kind of practices that the Chinese state is now using to bring innovation to the centerpiece of societal dynamics? That would be something behind it.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you for the organizers. It's such an amazing arrangement. I have the PPT only so that if I'm very fast, if Kambi is not able to catch, so it's nothing beyond what I'm speaking about. It's just the first, with some bringing in some culture. So I'm looking at the popular culture. So I explore popular culture that settles into society as part of daily existence, and to discuss the social and cultural aspects. So to begin with, I want to say that when I started thinking about this idea, that was exactly the time when we were thinking about editing a volume in honor of Professor Patricia Roy. And I must say that I'm extremely encouraged by her methodology of looking at popular culture to begin with. So when we look at so what are the possible meanings of popular culture? That's what this paper looks at to begin with. So in contemporary mainstream China. So while the concept of popular invariably refers to something which is common among the majority of people, the social sciences also looks at popular culture, one that represents through language, religion, customs, beliefs, and through time and spaces as explored ethnographically or statistically. So contrary to the general understanding, popular culture was the result of, was not only the result of industrialization and commercialization. However, historians cannot deny that popular culture existed even before, or even in the pre-industrial times. Because what was popular basically turned into mass culture because of the mass media and efforts to reach the larger public. So that's how it became more popular, but it was always existing. So first point, I'm looking from the common culture, common traditional culture to popular culture. Historically, Confucius teachings play a very important role in daily life in China. Though Buddhism and Taoism held very high spiritual value, but Confucianism was the one, the philosophy was the one which actually connected to people's material lives and individuals' groups at the psychological level. So Confucianism borrowed extensively from Taoism and Buddhism over the course of its history. There is one example of yin yang, how in Confucianism it was the understanding of cosmos, of complementary rule, but in Taoism, but in Confucianism when it was adopted, it was seen as a hierarchical binary of gender as it plays out everywhere. So therefore it is claimed that Confucianism as a way of life was drawn from the Chinese culture and not the other way around. So therefore in history, Confucianism has been idealized, defied, dismissed, verified, and then even rehabilitated in the last millennium. So one can see that, one can easily conclude that ideas and ways of living advocated in Confucianism as interpreted by people in different times over the period of history became the common tradition and the culture of the majority of Han Chinese. Thus, the Confucian worldview on cosmos came to be followed as mass or the popular culture, though not as part or much a part of the folk culture from the Han dynasty onwards. Now looking at the creative dialogue between popular culture and folk cultures. So in Chinese history, we all know unification of China happened during the 2021 by Emperor Qin Shi Huangdi. Although it was a political, economic, and cultural unification, the most prominent practices of culture in China was writing. And because of this writing, the distinctive artistic features which led to the birth of Chinese characters, calligraphy, literature, paintings, and other forms also came into being. Other defining feature was bronze work, jade, and I'll not go into the details, but not only Confucianism, but Taoism also came to be part of people's practical life during the Han Dynasty. Sometimes it was subverting and sometimes it was blending it with the existing folk culture. Throughout history, the Hans have been expanding themselves towards and sometimes they are amalgamating to different nationalities owing to their socio-political and economic needs. Nonetheless, the culture of elite invariably tend to bypass, suppress, or blend in with the folk culture to establish norms of culture of the masses, which in turn forms the popular culture. Looking at the tensions between dominant culture and resistant voices. Through popular culture, through folk culture, even though the folk culture got mingled with popular culture at large, it is also managed to maintain some of the, it did manage to maintain some of its uniqueness, along with, even though it was coexisting with popular culture, because of its nature of being pushed into the suburbs or pushed into the interiors by the Hans when they come and settle. So invariably the Hans used to settle in the geographically better conditions, and the minorities used to get pushed inwards. So the pouring of Han into Xinjiang and Tibetan regions started during Ming Dynasty and continued until the Qin, and today we all know the situation. So in post-liberation, though they are identified as ethnic minorities in spite of ethnocentrism being contrary to the founding of PRC, However, they are viewed as inferior to the highly civilized Han Chinese. Therefore, political centralism through economic and social measures have been fundamental to state efforts to integrate them. However, in such a scheme of things of integration, cultural diversity proves to be an obstacle, a major hurdle. Therefore, even though there are some measures to preserve or stage play the minority culture for the tourism purposes, there's a constant anxiety around this. So, creating friction between the dominant and the resistant voices. Now, the cultural history which came into being in the past decades, I'm looking at how the cultural history came into being at the birth of modern avatar of Confucianism. With the entry of Western culture during the 19th and the early 20th century, China faced several phases of challenges, starting from the need to create this new culture and new identity for Chinese people, and the spread of Marxism, which challenged the traditional Confucian culture in a revolutionary way, which led to the Communist Revolution. In post-liberation China, the CPC led by Mao continued to spearhead a culture of revolution, which outrightly rejected Confucius' values, promoting Marxist paths to liberation. It was the mass culture, which encapsulated the mass production, mass education, mass media, mass or collective cause, mass dressing, everyone used to dress alike, and mass kitchen. The mass culture based on community practices with a common goal formed the basis of popular culture in Maoist China. However, during Cultural Revolution, which was aimed at getting rid of the four olds, the chaos and confusion that followed led to the degeneration of the cultural consciousness among the masses. Coming to the reform and opening up, followed by globalization, which actually challenged the earlier ideas of mass culture, and Marxist modernism also. With the growth of internet in the 20th century, it influenced the influence of Western culture reached its peak. So once again, it challenged Chinese leaders and the Chinese people themselves found the need to preserve their culture. And therefore, there was a need to relook and revive the Chinese culture, and by looming fear of reviving traditional Confucian ideology. The Chinese government started re-emphasizing Chinese traditional socio-political thoughts. We know the example of Hu Jintao, where he talks about the harmonious society for the first time in 2003. His purpose was to address the inequalities which came about of PPP reforms. In 2012, President Xi Jinping introduced the idea of Chinese dream, highlighting the centrality of Confucius thought in Chinese culture. He took up the mission of rejuvenating the Chinese nation, aiming to align culture with the framework of being Chinese. The gap thus created by the lack of Maoism and Marxism was filled up by cultural ideology. The Chinese government and the people were convinced that Confucianism can serve the ideological foundation for Chinese modernization. So the culture thus rediscovered needed to be decimated, as the lost Chinese culture needed to be revived. So with this came the need to popularize Chinese culture and bring it into the mainstream. So presenting it as a widely popular, not just the elite culture, which it was believed before. So as a result, the state needed to use market forces, and thus the media to create a nuanced understanding of the contemporary mainstream popular culture in China. The state market nexus then resulted in a cultural production in the larger context of globalizing capitalism. Now, what is popular culture in China today? As China started looking back, it was realized that Confucianism has all along guided the way of living and the popular culture in China, especially when it came to interpersonal relationship, family, kinship, etc. So as part of this discovery, as part of this discussion, the rediscovery of Confucian way of life gained popularity. And Chinese cultures increasingly started being recognized as being associated with Confucianism. So there were efforts to revive the three fundamental bonds and the five constant virtues, which believed to be the source of sustaining a harmonious society in new forms. So there were new, renewed forms of understanding this. Several studies show that even today, Chinese people largely continue to maintain Confucius beliefs especially around marriage, divorce, children, filial piety, and within the family in general. However, difference of opinion from traditional ideas on having children or bringing up children, or even among regarding marriage, was highest among young women, according to a study. The most visible spaces where Confucian ideas were revived are in the areas of self-cultivation and self-actualization. which involves cultivating the lesser self for the greater self, that is, for the greater good. So the virtue, just quickly going through the 5 virtues. Okay. So quickly going to the 5 virtues, Ren, that is understood to be as, benevolence, was in the new sense looked at with love and sense of humanity, co-humanness. And the second virtue, that is righteousness, is now looked at as proper social behavior. Li, that is propriety, is now looked at as self-cultivation and social harmony. And Tru, that is wisdom and knowledge, is now looked at as the ability to see right from wrong. It is from looking at it from the scientific and logical understanding. And Xin, the last one, is the trustworthiness, is looked at in a new sense as not breaking promises and keeping your word. So based on these principles of the greater self, the lesser self, as well as the 5 virtues, Chinese society has followed certain social behaviors and customs and ways of life. So quickly, basically, most important being the 𝐂𝐮 in the first half also saying that how important it is to create a network. So in Chinese society really depends a lot on relationships, that is 𝐂𝐮, or I mean, if the translation is extremely problematic. It's still, I don't agree with relationships, yeah, but contacts or yeah, so let me leave that there. It's a problematic issue. So basically, so how this 𝐂𝐮 then is clubbed with renqing, that is, favors, and liwu, the gifts, and mianzi, that is face, face, basically keeping face, and other such ideas. So the Chinese society is deeply rooted in this 𝐂𝐮 network. And the Confucian principle, so therefore I will not go into the details, but the lesser self of 𝐂𝐮 has to ultimately serve the needs of the greater selves. So Confucian principle of 3 fundamental bonds and 5 constant virtues thus continue to be the guiding principles for people to follow and rely upon, and to ensure harmony and peace in the contemporary Chinese society. So coming to my conclusion, popular culture in today has taken shape through its historical evolution. I'll not go into the details, but yes, the ideas have taken the shape of cultural nationalism and assertion that it has a global applicability. However, the perennial issue of inequalities based on hierarchy and gender by the authoritarianism of 3 bonds and 5 virtues are still readily visible in the contemporary society. Therefore, the fact that it has drawn wide attention and needs to be deconstructed is that why CPC, which has fought against conservatism based on Confucian principles throughout its revolutionary era and throughout these century, is now promoting traditional culture. We all know that Xi Jinping, what he's been saying, but I'll just cut short that. But basically, the government is organizing, speaking about how Confucianism and the ideas of Confucianism is so fundamental of being Chinese. And therefore, some scholars have identified Confucianism as an alternative ideological tool used by the Chinese government, which reveals the declining influence of Marxism, and have proposed the idea of Confucius Marxism, falling behind on the traditional culture based on Confucius principle and propagating the same as being Chinese, suits the government in maintaining social order, creating the image of a harmoniously functioning society. It suits the market for commercial profit. However, it threatens to undermine the century-long efforts made by the Chinese people for liberation, especially in the absence of a constructive encounter between Confucianism and Marxism, which can rarely be seated in the same table. Thank you.
Okay, thanks. We've got very little time left. I'm just going to make 2 points here. Ways obviously are now mounting a very, very difficult tiger. This whole question of making Confucianism as the basis of for the establishment of the Communist Party is likely to create far more troubles down the road. Usha has brought up a very fascinating issue about how do we understand popular culture and the use of Confucianism, which was essentially a philosophy of social control through a certain kind of a structure. And that was very have completely relinked from popular culture. So how is this issue going to play out, and how is the Chinese society going to deal with this? I think it comes out of here, but Q&A. And finally, we come to Beam, who is going to, he teaches in the Department of Political Science at the School of Social Sciences at the University of Hyderabad, and he will be speaking on the party's internal as political governance. Those of you who follow the Communist Party dynamics or what the party is up to would be familiar with Beam's writings. He's probably among the few people who are actually commenting on the nitty-gritty of the CPC and what's happening within it, and how the whole system is undergoing a massive transformation. So that's Beam 3.
Yeah, thank you, ma'am and Chair, and thank you, ICS, and also, ma'am, once again for a very generous introduction here. And definitely, I thank you, IIM Indore and Professor Venkat here and Institute of Chinese Studies for inviting me to be part of this panel on state of the field. So as Professor Venkat, when he asked me, like, is your topic the right one that you sent it? So I said, yeah, parties internal, I just want to provoke that and really problematize why parties internal is so important. Because as per the presentations that we, other splendid presentations here, 5 presentations, really spoke about how it's not only external, but also the need for understanding China's domestic and also internal. So when I say, if Dr. Atul said about let's not read or really nuanced reading on Western literature or Chinese literature, so I follow an eclectic path that I read both the Western sources and as well as the Chinese documents, really pass what things are about. So in my presentation, I would look into some of the policy documents, but at the same time, focus on at least 2 institutions here. One is the Organization Department of the CPC, and second one is the United Front Work Department. If you have to really look at the Organization Department of the CPC today, and increasingly that, as Anushka in our presentation, you said, today China is run by engineers. So once upon a time when I started my research, I thought that China is going to be liberal, because you only see most of the recruits or, graduates from law school, from Harvard or, Princeton or Yale Law School, and have a lot of MBA degrees and all. But to my mind today, what we see is they excelled on what they have done. And now it's run by engineers today. And definitely the organization department, I think, if you see the latest round of provincial recruitments happening, most of them are all STEM related recruits happening there, and most of the cadres are from STEM subjects and all, and definitely STEM plus management and law. So even Xi Jinping, he being the #1 person in China today, has a law degree, and but he has excelled in making the rule of law in China as the rule under the party state. So you can imagine how the next innovation-led legal regime in China would be. So we can look into that. And other is with regard to also when recruitment happening is with regard to the virtue that Dr. Usha was talking about is the Confucian culture that is important. So in China, and if you really look into some of these penal rules and regulations introduced by the Central Discipline Inspection Commission, that's the party watchdog, they follow Buddhist traditions. Like suppose if you have to say about Buddhism of Eightfold Path and Four Noble Truths, so Passion Quitting, and four moods of decadence, they exactly follow what the Buddhist tradition look like and says about it. So definitely the party dwelling on some of the traditional cultures, it has become very important. And that doesn't mean that Marxism-Leninism is not important. It is definitely important. But for a Communist Party to sustain, I think ideology is not sufficient. and it is therefore betting on culture, which is damn important today in China. And that is what we see. And also, in its many of these policies with regard to recruitment of cadres, vetting processes, we see a lot of policies that relate to not only about Marxism, 𝐂𝐮𝐫𝐽𝐻, but also about how you are so virtuous, a noble cadre. So therefore, if you have to say, domestically, it is more of politics in command, but with cultural emphasis. So if you have to move into the external dimension, you could see more of economics in command, kind of an argument that I really want to say here. The second is with regard to United Front Work Department. Dr. Atul spoke about the book that he read, the rise of China's foreign ministry. And if you look into their recruitments, we see a lot of these folks who are in the foreign ministry are actually trained in United Front Work Department. They are not career bureaucrats, but they are trained there, and they're being appointed as ambassadors and deputy mission chiefs in different parts of the world to make. Now they're being trained in minority ethnic regions in China for up to number 10 to 15 years. Then they come, and today has been a very important, cadre for the foreign ministry. And as we know that since China is not a normal, like the Western, state that we really look into. It is because People's Republic of China is being established by the Communist Party of China, not the other way around. So therefore, sometimes using Western concepts and variables doesn't fit how they articulate China thinks about itself. So it becomes very important for us to really look into how this distinction is being made here. And therefore, even with regard to corruption cases, now every year we get in the month of December, I always have a lot of documents because it's annual documents they keep on publishing. So this year they said 94,000 people were investigated. And for breaking, those 8 rules, modes of decadence, even if you don't work, you are being tried for investigation, So even policy paralysis is a problem there. So how do you really go about it? So therefore, looking into these documents, you see what is the stress and what is the emphasis that China is really looking at it. Now, and today, yesterday's, fourth plenum, the 20th Party Congress Central Committee report communique that I was reading in the morning, and I could see like almost 9 military leaders were purged. And that shows that it vindicates what Atul says, that Xi Jinping is the Harshin there. So he is still the core. And there is no, opposition there in China ready to challenge him. And so there are reports also how they go about it. And also looking into, last week, there was a Council Global Development Forum. And then they talked about anti-corruption. And a lot of world leaders who were present in Beijing were discussing about anti-corruption, how China's model of anti-corruption is really have helped China to overcome a lot of it. Having said that, that doesn't mean that China is being so successful there. So, and the Central Committee this time, the plenary we see, look at the pictures that has come out. So we see many of the permanent Central Committee members not present. That means that they are not, in the podium there. So this also shows that how Xi Jinping is still in control, and although using corruption as a tool to really negotiate and weaponize to attack not only so-called non-performing, in fact, we use the Indian language to say, non-performing assets, like for the Chinese politicians. You have to take voluntary retirement, if not. So that is why you have leaders, including the latest round of, the purge was the Thang Rai-chen, who was an agriculture minister. He was just purged in and expelled from the party in September. So it's not just one or two military leaders, but also only one area that one doesn't see anti-corruption forays or very, robust or rejuvenated anti-corruption campaign is vis-a-vis the doctors in China. They have attacked all the pharma companies, but not the doctors. Because they also know that if you attack doctors, who will treat Chinese people? And because the party exists for the people, people is the first. So they're the only place where they have returned. So I think go down short and we can have more discussions in the Q&A. Thank you for indulging.
Thanks, Vic. Thanks, Beam. Moral of the story, those who want to go and study in China, go and study medicine. But I think Beam's presentation brought out three very fascinating aspects of the functioning of the Communist Party today, which is training, recruitment, and discipline. And what has come out in his in the way in which he gave us a picture about internal parties internal is that there's plenty of old wine in new bottles, but also plenty of new wine. And how Xi Jinping is negotiating this mix is something that I think we need more and more scholars to study the Communist Party. I mean, we keep asking, how long will the party go on? The party is over. Why is it? I think this merits serious study. We've had 5 presentations, very heavy session. This was not a regular session, as I said, it was more to whet your collective appetites about the kind of things that are now beginning to fascinate us towards areas of scholarship and what is coming out. And maybe you have some good ideas about how to pick up some new themes. So all those of you who have some questions, please utilize the lunchtime for at least people. And thank you all very much. I'm sure you found it as fascinating as I did.
Yeah, so the lunch is in year 1, the place where you have breakfast. But before we conclude this session, I would request Ambassador Ashok Kanta to come out to the stage and present mementos to all the panelists. Sir, please. More importantly, as he's saying, they would not have stopped also without the chair. It's a very powerful position. Okay, next we go in the order. Anushka. This. Next, Atul. Then I'm cut. Next, Anand. Anand, please. Like how? Usha Chandan. Good. This is really the same. And being worked. So once meet is done, then group photography will all the session, the panelists of the session, and please come together and make up the. Please come forward. Yeah, just
Now let's move to year 1 for lunch, and please may I request all of you to be there on time for the thematic panels. Starts at 2:30 in the F block. We are